Let's talk about trees in the street. Megan Maurer, Trees on the Street, the Social Value of Green Infrastructure in New York City.
My name is Megan Maurer, and I'm going to talk to you today about a project that we are just starting to develop that examines the relationship between New Yorkers and their street trees. Why do we care about this relationship? Well, there's this big question: how do we make cities resilient in the face of climate change impacts? And given the room, I don't think I have to explain to you why we care about this question and why we need to answer it. But what I want to draw your attention to is that green infrastructures, things like street trees, like planted medians, living roofs, bioswales, are increasingly being used in New York and around the world to address the impacts of climate change in cities. And this is because green infrastructures are believed to have these multi-dimensional effects. So they can offer a lot of ecological services, like slowing the flow of stormwater into sewage drains, retaining water. But they're also believed to have a whole host of economic, health, and psychological effects. However, research on all of this, from ecology to social benefit, is still ongoing, and particularly we don't know a lot about the social benefits of green infrastructures. And what we do know suggests that there's a really mixed impact, that they're not necessarily always good. Which leads us to the second question of what is the good urban life? We need to know how do people define well-being in living in a city? What do they expect their built and living environments to do for them? What do they want for their city, for their families, for their communities, for their future? So what we're really looking at is this intersection here. We want a city that is livable and sustainable. We can have an ecologically resilient city, but if no one wants to live in it and they're absolutely miserable, it's not very sustainable. And so this is where we're focusing our research. We want to know where green infrastructures fall here. Are they just something that adds ecological resiliency, or are there certain infrastructures or aspects of infrastructures that also add to well-being? Where is there a disjuncture, and where do these things overlap for people? So ultimately, we want to know what the social impacts of green infrastructures are in New York City. Our starting point for asking this question are bioswales. As many of you might be aware, New York City has a problem managing its stormwater runoff. Tearing up the sewer system and making it bigger isn't really an option. And so the city has invested a great deal in bioswales, these plantings which slow the flow of stormwater runoff into the sewers and help retain water. The problem is that preliminary evidence suggests that people don't like them. So here we have that mismatch. What we know or think we know will make cities more ecologically resilient is not always something that makes them places they want to live. And why is that? It could be that there's a lack of control or involvement in the design, implementation, and management process. It could be existing aesthetic preferences. People just don't think they look the way a streetscape should look. There could be a perceived role of green infrastructures in exacerbating social inequalities via processes like gentrification. There could be a lack of available language to name, discuss, and interpret green infrastructures. The word bioswale isn't very attractive, and most people don't know what it is, that word means. And there could be this set of existing imaginaries that people have about what a city should be and what the role of nature should be in it, and this stands in violation of that. It's likely some combination of all of these things. And so to answer this question, we're turning to street trees and tree pits to unpack the when, why, and how of this mismatch between livability and sustainability. Why tree pits, if bioswales was what started us on this journey? Tree pits are an established infrastructure. This has been around in one form or another in New York City for a very long time. So people have an existing relationship to it, and that gives us a nice place to start understanding how that relationship forms and changes over time. So in a future phase of this project, we can then look at bioswales, having a better more robust understanding of how people form relationships to green infrastructures, and we can perhaps design interventions and assess the impact of those in changing the relationship that people have. Also, street trees and tree pits, if we're going to pick a green infrastructure that isn't bioswales, mirror bioswales quite well in form and function in a lot of ways. As I mentioned, there's an existing set of norms and an aesthetic vernacular people have for a tree-lined street. We have existing civic mediators, organizations like Trees New York, that are doing a lot of work to educate people about the role of street trees in the city and to create positive relationships. So we can also look at the role that the civic mediation does. And we have some existing data sets. There have been a great deal of surveying on the benefits, ecological and social, of street trees and the health of the trees in New York and involvement in stewardship. And that data has actually really helped us move this project along by pointing out some really interesting relationships. For example, we know that properly stewarded trees, that is, trees stewarded to the best interest of the tree, are healthier than trees that are not stewarded at all, but that trees that are stewarded in ways that do not contribute to the health of the tree actually make the tree less healthy. So, believe it or not, the tree with the trash in it is probably like going to be doing better than the tree covered in ivy or the tree that has all this planting and mulching up around its trunk. We want healthier trees because healthier trees perform their environmental function better. So here we have this nice, we can draw a direct relationship between the ways that people are relating to their street trees and the ecological impact that they're having. And so we want to drill down into that relationship that people have with their street trees, how it forms, how it functions. And to do that, we are doing an ethnography of New York City tree pits. The pits and the trees themselves can tell us a great deal about their social life. For example, whether they are stewarded or not. And you can gain a fair bit of that information by just walking around and observing the pits and doing surveys or tree censuses. And as I mentioned, some of this data has already been done. There are actually every 5 years the trees, 2000, I'm not going to remember the years, but there are several tree censuses that have been done. And those are really useful, those big data sets, and we're also thinking of compiling one ourselves that looks at a typology of different kinds of tree pits, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. And these big data sets can tell us about relationships between different variables in terms of tree health and stewardship, but there are things that it can't tell us. For example, it can't tell us if people like street trees or not, whether they steward them or not, whether there's any relationship between those two things for people, and how those points of view about whether trees are good or bad and should or should not be taken care of, how that fits into into the wider set of experiences that New Yorkers have about living in a city and their ideas about what a good urban life is. But we can get at those relationships by doing a small, intensive study through prolonged observation and in-depth interviewing. And then we can use results from statistical and spatial analyses of these larger data sets to inform that process and vice versa. So that is what we are proposing to do. As I mentioned, we're just beginning, and we're in our very preliminary stages with this project, and so which means we're mostly just looking at street trees right now. And our preliminary site is the zip code of 10025, just south of here. Why this zip code? There's a diversity of land uses, both commercial and housing, different types of buildings, different types of land uses. It's relatively diverse for the borough of Manhattan, which isn't saying a whole lot, but it says something. And it's easy to access. I live and commute through the zip code, and since this is preliminary, it's nice to not have to schlep all the way out to the farthest reaches of Queens. We do hope to eventually run this in other zip codes throughout the city to be more representative and diverse in our sample. Observations consist of walking up and down the street and looking at tree pits and noticing variation. I take notes about things that stand out, patterns that I see, questions that arise. I take pictures of each of the noted tree pits, and then we sort of start to try and make sense of all that information. Looking at all this variability, we can sort of start to categorize it and see some relationships between it. And one of the things that we've already kind of noticed is that tree pits don't necessarily come as individuals. They come as what we're calling often as sets. You'll have 2 to, I've even seen 12 pits in a row that have a very similar set of plants, very similar guard. They're clearly part of the same stewardship regime, and that often tracks the presence of a building in the landscape, so we can assume that there's stewardship happening and there's some sort of relationship between the property boundary and the care of the tree pits. And now suddenly we're not dealing with individual trees, we can actually remap our terrain, and we can deal with groups of trees, which makes things a little more manageable. And so we want to keep sifting through all this variability to create a typology of street trees and tree pits, and then we want to catalog that, or categorize it, in relationship to the variation, losing my words here. Create a typology of street tree pits, and then using these other data sets that we have on tree health and stewardship, sort of catalog this variation in relation to the presence or absence of stewardship and the health of the tree. So we have kind of a matrix here, and then do some intentional selection of different kinds of tree pits that will give us kind of a range of different stewardship regimes that we can look at. Once we have these trees of interest, we want to examine its social life through these 4 interlocking kinds of dimensions. That's how I'm sort of conceptualizing of it, these 4 overlapping dimensions of the social life of a tree. We have the history of the tree. When was it planted? Has it been stewarded throughout its life? Has that changed over the course of the tree's life? What is the history of the neighborhood, the block, the building that it's located in? What is the history of the policy regimes governing the tree pit? These have changed over time. And actually, the size and structure of the tree pit can give us some sense of when it was planted as the policy regimes have changed. Are those policies something people are aware of or care about when they steward the tree? Is the tree even stewarded? By whom? Why are they doing it? Why is a tree neglected? What impact does that have on the street, the building, the community, the ecosystem? And what impact does the ecosystem have on the tree? Is this tree the favorite tree of dear Fluffy, who loves to urinate there every morning? Is this a tree near a pigeon roost? Has it been exposed to an extreme weather event or pest? All of these things are going to help us understand the relationship between New York City residents and their trees, and between the trees and the city. And so our next steps, beyond creating this typology and looking and creating our sample set for more intensive study, is to continue doing observation. We can learn a lot about the life of a tree over time. Seasonal change really affects the way trees live in the city and the ways people relate to them. So we want to continue observing, and we need to figure out how frequently do we observe? How standardized is the observational process? How standardized is the photographing process? How replicable is the study going to be? We have those big data sets, and we would like to analyze them, things like 311 calls, tree census data, stewardship survey data, look for relationships there that can help guide our ethnographic process. We need to conduct interviews, and we'll have IRB approval to do that soon. And we're also looking at ways we can talk to people about much more casual relationships with trees. Most New Yorkers relate to trees by walking by them, taking a smoke break, looking out their window. How do we talk to them about their relationship to the tree and what the tree means to them? How do we figure out the neutral to negative relationships to trees? It's easy to find the people who care about them and are stewarding them. How about the people who want them cut down? I'd love to know their thoughts too. And so that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, but in my neighborhood, which is not this upper-class fancy neighborhood, I won't say where it is, but it's on the wrong side of Broadway and the wrong side of Dyckman. There's lots of tree pits without trees in them. No trees at all, not even cut down. And as far as I can tell, they get created by the city, and then it's up to the people who are there to put plants in them or not. So some store owners, like the hardware store guy who sells, garden products, he made a really nice one. And a very upscale restaurant made a really nice one, and the dry cleaner couldn't care less. So they seem to encourage people to do it, and then they take ownership of it, right? Because they planted it.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to that, because one of my ongoing questions is, does the tree even matter to people, or do they just want a little space to garden?
Not a tree inside.
So I'm really curious. I'm going to have to come visit.
Are you aware of the free trees that are available through the New York Restoration Project?
I'm sorry, what was the project? Oh yeah, that's the, I want to say Barbara Streisand. Oh, that's a different one. Okay. Bette Midler, yes. Sorry. I get them confused. Sorry to everybody. I'm aware of that program. I have not made contact with anyone from that organization yet, but it's on my list. For the tree, I'm sorry, what? Well, they are flourishing right now in many places across the city. Some New Yorkers hate them, but many New Yorkers love them, and I think they're here to stay. I don't think they're going anywhere.
Thank you. This is super interesting. One question that came to my mind the other week, I was walking by a huge tree that had fallen onto a car, and a lot of neighbors were standing outside watching it get cut up and chipped up. And so I'm thinking, you mentioned that bioswales already have a kind of negative connotation around them. And I wonder how people feel about trees like as hazards, because I don't think a bioswale can hurt people, but trees can definitely damage property and probably will be more as there are more storms. So I don't know, is that already part of your investigation? Have you found anything along those lines?
Yeah, so there's definitely a set of concerns and negative attitudes towards trees out there. That's part of the reason that we want to pull all the 311 call data and look at that. It's a chance for New Yorkers to complain about trees. I've also started having some conversations with Trees New York, who runs a citizen pruner program, and part of what they're doing is trying to prevent things like that from happening by educating people on how to prune a tree and how to observe a tree and to know when it's in danger of falling on things and when it's not, based on anecdotal evidence and sort of cursorily looking at things. The biggest concern that people have about trees is falling on things. So that seems to be a real worry that people have, and definitely something to look at.
We better move on.